Good evening, dear friends. I hope you found yourself in a comfortable spot tonight, perhaps nestled in your favorite chair or already settled beneath soft blankets that smell of home and comfort. Dim those lights, let the day's worries drift away like autumn leaves on a gentle breeze, and let's embark on a new chapter together through the quiet corridors of history. Before we begin this soothing journey, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? What's your favorite way to unwind after a long day? Perhaps it's a warm cup of tea, or the soft glow of candlelight, or simply the comfort of knowing that somewhere in the world, others are sharing this peaceful moment with you. If this content helps you relax and drift towards sleep, please subscribe to join our growing community of evening wanderers. A gentle like and share would mean the world to me. And if you have any suggestions for future stories to explore together in these quiet hours, please leave them in the comments. Tonight, we're going to travel softly through time, visiting remarkable souls whose stories have been whispered through centuries. We'll meet a German princess who transformed herself into one of Russia's most fascinating empresses, not through birthright, but through intelligence and determination. We'll journey alongside explorers who chased golden dreams through South American jungles, their hopes as bright and elusive as morning mist. We'll witness the birth of the Olympic Games in ancient Greece, where athletes honored the gods with their dedication. And we'll stand in awe of a magnificent bronze statue that once watched over a harbor, even in its eventual fall, finding a kind of eternal beauty. These aren't just tales of the past, dear friends. They're gentle reminders of the countless souls who have walked this earth before us, each carrying their own dreams, struggles, and moments of quiet triumph. Tonight, let their stories become a soft murmur that carries you toward rest, like the distant sound of waves against a peaceful shore. So close your eyes if you'd like, or let them rest softly wherever feels comfortable. Take a deep breath in and let it out slowly. Feel your shoulders relaxing, your breathing deepening. We have all the time in the world tonight. There's nowhere else to be, nothing else you need to do. Just you, me, and these gentle tales from long ago. Let's begin our journey with a young woman named Sophie, who would one day be known to history as Catherine the Great, but who started life as simply a minor German princess with dreams far larger than her small world seemed to allow. In the gentle twilight of an 18th century evening, in a modest castle in the quiet German principality of Anhalt-Zerbst, a baby girl took her first breath. The year was 1729, and spring was painting the countryside in soft greens and delicate blossoms. This child, christened Sophie Friederike Auguste, entered a world that seemed to whisper of possibilities just beyond the horizon. Her father was a Prussian general, a man of duty and discipline, while her mother carried the sharp ambitions that often stirred in the hearts of minor nobility, dreams of elevating their family's position through careful alliances and clever marriages. Little Sophie, even as a young girl, seemed to sense these undercurrents of aspiration that flowed through her household like an underground stream. The castle where she spent her early years was comfortable but not grand, filled with the quiet sounds of daily life, footsteps on stone floors, the rustle of silk gowns, the soft murmur of conversations in multiple languages. For Sophie was being raised to be cosmopolitan, to speak French as fluently as German, to understand the delicate art of court manners and diplomacy. Even as a young girl, there was something different about Sophie. While other children her age might play with dolls or chase butterflies in the garden, she could often be found curled up with a book, her young mind already hungry for knowledge and stories of distant lands. She absorbed languages with ease, as if words were music that her soul naturally understood. She watched the adults around her with the keen observation of someone who instinctively knew that knowledge was power, and that understanding people was the key to navigating the complex world of nobility. Her tutors noted her unusual intelligence, her ability to grasp concepts quickly and retain information with remarkable clarity. But perhaps more importantly, they observed her natural poise, the way she could sit quietly and listen, absorbing not just the words being spoken, but the emotions and intentions behind them. These were skills that would serve her well in the years to come, though none could have imagined just how far this minor German princess would travel from her quiet beginnings. As Sophie grew, so did her awareness of the larger world beyond her family's modest domain. She heard whispers of the great courts of Europe, Versailles with its glittering excess, Vienna with its imperial majesty, and far to the east, the mysterious and vast Russian Empire. These places existed in her imagination like fairy tale kingdoms, distant and magical, places where history was made and destinies were forged. Little did she know that far away, in the cold splendor of St. Petersburg, wheels were already turning that would forever change her life.
Imagine, if you will, the soft crunch of snow beneath carriage wheels, the gentle sway of a vehicle traveling across the vast Russian landscape. It was the winter of 1744, and 14-year-old Sophie was making a journey that would transform not just her own life, but the course of an empire. The invitation had come like something from a dream. Empress Elizabeth of Russia had chosen her to be the bride of the future Tsar, her nephew Peter. As the carriage rolled through endless forests dusted with snow, past villages where smoke curled peacefully from chimneys, Sophie must have gazed out at this foreign landscape with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. Everything here was different from her small German world. The scale was grander, the cold more bitter. The very air seemed to whisper of power and possibility. Russia in those days was like a sleeping giant, vast and rich and mysterious to Western European eyes. The court of St. Petersburg was known for its Byzantine complexity, its orthodox rituals, and its potential for both elevation and destruction. Young nobles from across Europe dreamed of Russian connections, but few were actually summoned to the heart of this empire. Sophie's transformation began almost immediately upon her arrival. The girl who had been content with quiet study and modest German customs now found herself immersed in the elaborate world of Russian court life. She was expected to learn not just a new language, but an entirely new way of being, new gestures, new protocols, new ways of thinking about power and faith and identity. The process was both exhilarating and exhausting. Day after day, Sophie worked with tutors to master Russian, to understand Orthodox theology, to grasp the subtle signals and hierarchies that governed court behavior. She approached each lesson with the same quiet intensity that had marked her childhood studies, but now the stakes were infinitely higher. This wasn't just about becoming educated, it was about becoming Russian. And then came her conversion to Orthodox Christianity, a moment that symbolically marked her rebirth as Catherine Alexeyevna. The ceremony was both solemn and transformative, conducted in one of St. Petersburg's magnificent cathedrals, surrounded by icons that seemed to glow in the candlelight. As she spoke the words of her new faith, Sophie was not just accepting a religion, she was accepting a new identity, a new destiny. But perhaps the most challenging part of her transformation was meeting Peter, the young man who would one day be her husband and emperor. Even in those early days, it was clear that Peter was complicated. He was childlike in some ways, fascinated by military games and toy soldiers, but seemingly uninterested in the serious business of governing or the subtle arts of courtship. Where Catherine, as we must now call her, observed everything with that same keen intelligence that had marked her since childhood. She watched, she learned, she adapted. And slowly, quietly, she began to understand that in this vast empire, there might be room not just for her to survive, but for her to truly flourish.
In the hushed corridors of the Winter Palace, where footsteps echoed on marble floors and whispers carried secrets from room to room, young Catherine was learning perhaps the most valuable lesson of her life, the art of waiting. Her marriage to Peter in 1745 was everything a royal wedding should be on the surface: magnificent, symbolic, politically significant. But beneath the golden ceremony lay the quiet reality of two young people, essentially strangers, bound together by imperial decree rather than affection. The early years of Catherine's marriage were like a long, careful dance. She learned to smile at the right moments, to nod graciously during court functions, to present herself as the perfect future empress while privately observing the intricate power dynamics that surrounded her. Peter, meanwhile, remained obsessed with his toy soldiers, his military drills, and his admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia, an enthusiasm that made many Russians uncomfortable, given their recent conflicts with Prussia. During these quiet years, Catherine discovered something that would shape the rest of her life: the profound joy of intellectual pursuit. In her private chambers, away from the demands of court life, she created a sanctuary of learning. Books became her constant companions: works of philosophy by French Enlightenment thinkers, treatises on government and law, historical accounts of great rulers and their achievements. She read Montesquieu's thoughts on the separation of powers, Voltaire's critiques of religious intolerance, and Diderot's revolutionary ideas about human rights and progress. This wasn't mere casual reading. Catherine approached these texts with the intensity of a scholar. She took notes, wrote lengthy letters to European intellectuals, and began to develop her own ideas about what enlightened government might look like. In an age when many rulers were content to inherit tradition unchanged, Catherine was quietly imagining how power might be used not just to control, but to improve the lives of subjects. Her correspondence with Voltaire became particularly important to her. The great philosopher, charmed by this thoughtful young woman writing from the distant Russian court, encouraged her intellectual development and praised her insights. Through their letters, Catherine connected with the broader world of European thought, positioning herself as someone who understood not just Russian traditions, but the cutting-edge ideas that were reshaping Western civilization. But Catherine was also learning practical lessons about survival in the imperial court. She watched how Elizabeth ruled. The empress was capable and charismatic, but also moody and prone to sudden changes of favor. She observed which courtiers rose and fell, which approaches to power worked, and which led to exile. She began to cultivate her own network of allies, carefully and quietly building relationships with key officials, military officers, and influential nobles. Most importantly, she was learning to manage her relationship with Peter. As he grew older, his eccentricities became more pronounced and his unsuitability for rule more apparent. But rather than openly criticize him, Catherine maintained the appearance of wifely loyalty, while privately positioning herself as a more suitable alternative. She was learning, in those quiet years, that sometimes the most powerful action is patient preparation. As the years drifted by like pages in a well-loved book, Catherine found herself entering what we might call her season of preparation, a time when, like a gardener tending seeds in winter, she was quietly cultivating the relationships and knowledge that would eventually bloom into power. The court of St. Petersburg had become her school, and she was proving to be an exceptional student. Her personal life during this period was complex, shaped by the growing distance between herself and Peter, who seemed incapable of maturing into the role that awaited him. While Peter played with his beloved toy soldiers and drilled his personal regiment in increasingly elaborate military games, Catherine was engaged in more subtle, but ultimately more significant pursuits. She was learning to navigate the intricate world of Russian politics, where a word whispered in the right ear could change the course of policy, and where loyalty was a currency more valuable than gold. One of Catherine's greatest assets was her ability to charm without threatening, to appear interested without seeming ambitious. She attended court functions with grace, participated in religious ceremonies with apparent devotion, and engaged in the social rituals of palace life with just the right balance of enthusiasm and dignity. Those around her began to see her not as a foreign interloper, but as someone who had truly become Russian in her heart and mind. Her relationship with Empress Elizabeth was particularly delicate and important. Elizabeth was childless and had chosen Peter as her successor, but she was not blind to his limitations. Catherine sensed that the Empress was watching her carefully, evaluating her worthiness not just as Peter's wife, but as a potential partner in governing the empire. Catherine made sure that whenever Elizabeth looked her way, she saw competence, loyalty, and intelligence. During this period, Catherine also began her first tentative romantic relationships outside her marriage. These weren't mere frivolous affairs. They were carefully chosen connections that served both emotional and political purposes. Her companions were often men of intelligence and influence, people who could provide her with insights into Russian society and support for her growing ambitions. Each relationship was conducted with discretion and strategic awareness, adding another layer to her understanding of how power really worked in the imperial court. But perhaps most importantly, these were the years when Catherine refined her vision of what Russia could become under enlightened rule. Through her extensive reading and correspondence with European intellectuals, she had developed ideas about legal reform, religious tolerance, educational improvement, and economic modernization. She began to see herself not just as a potential ruler, but as someone who could transform Russia from a traditional autocracy into something approaching the enlightened monarchies that were emerging elsewhere in Europe. As 1762 approached and Elizabeth's health began to decline, Catherine could sense that her long period of preparation was coming to an end. The question was no longer whether she would have an opportunity to rule, but whether she would have the courage and skill to seize that opportunity when it presented itself. In the quiet of her chambers, surrounded by her books and letters, Catherine prepared for what would become the defining moment of her extraordinary life.
On a cold January morning in 1762, Empress Elizabeth breathed her last, and with her death, the quiet world Catherine had known for 18 years suddenly shattered like ice on a winter pond. Peter ascended to the throne as Peter III, and almost immediately it became clear that Catherine's careful years of preparation had been wise indeed, for her husband proved spectacularly unsuited to the enormous responsibilities of ruling the Russian Empire. In just 6 short months, Peter managed to alienate virtually every important constituency in Russian society. He made peace with Prussia, abandoning military victories that had cost Russian blood and treasure. He spoke openly of his admiration for Frederick the Great, even going so far as to wear Prussian uniforms at court, a gesture that horrified Russian nobles and officers who had fought against Prussia. He mocked Orthodox traditions and spoke casually of reforming the church in ways that terrified the clergy. Most dangerously of all, he seemed to treat the throne not as a sacred trust, but as an opportunity to indulge his personal whims. Catherine watched these developments with a mixture of alarm and opportunity. She had spent years building relationships throughout Russian society, and now those relationships began to pay unexpected dividends. Officers approached her discreetly, expressing their concerns about Peter's erratic behavior. Nobles whispered their fears about the empire's direction. Even members of the clergy hinted that they might support a change in leadership if circumstances required it. The crisis came to a head in June 1762, when Catherine learned that Peter was planning to divorce her and possibly send her to a convent, a move that would eliminate her from court life entirely and remove any possibility of her ever influencing Russian policy. Faced with this threat, Catherine realized that her moment had arrived. After 18 years of patient preparation, she would have to act decisively or lose everything she had worked toward. The coup that followed was remarkable for its swiftness and efficiency. On the morning of June 28, 1762, while Peter was away at his palace outside St. Petersburg, Catherine put on a simple black dress and drove to the barracks of the Izmailovsky regiment. There, in words that had been carefully planned but delivered with apparent spontaneity, she declared herself the true sovereign of Russia, appealing to the soldiers' loyalty not as Peter's wife, but as someone who truly understood and loved the Russian people. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Regiment after regiment declared for Catherine. Nobles arrived to pledge their support. By afternoon, she was riding through St. Petersburg in imperial coach, accepting the acclamation of crowds who saw in her not a usurper, but a savior who had rescued them from an unsuitable ruler. Peter, when he learned what had happened, seemed almost relieved. He abdicated without significant resistance and was taken into comfortable custody. A few days later, he died under circumstances that remain mysterious, possibly murdered by overzealous supporters of Catherine, possibly the victim of a scuffle during an escape attempt. Catherine always maintained that she had not ordered his death, and there is no definitive evidence that she did. But she also never seemed particularly troubled by the convenient timing of her husband's demise. And so, in the space of a few dramatic days, the minor German princess who had arrived in Russia as a teenage bride had transformed herself into Catherine II, Empress and autocrat of all the Russians. The long period of waiting and preparation was over. Now would come the true test of whether her dreams of enlightened rule could survive contact with the harsh realities of imperial power.
In the early days of her reign, as summer softened into autumn and the golden light of late afternoon filtered through the windows of the Winter Palace, Catherine found herself facing a question that few rulers ever contemplate seriously. How does one transform the ideals of the Enlightenment into the practical policies of an absolute monarchy? For Catherine, this wasn't merely an intellectual exercise, it was the defining challenge of her life and reign. She had spent years absorbing the writings of Europe's greatest thinkers, corresponding with philosophers who dreamed of societies based on reason rather than tradition, justice rather than privilege, progress rather than stagnation. Now, suddenly, she had the power to attempt something unprecedented, creating an enlightened empire in the vast expanse of Russia, where millions of people lived under conditions that would have horrified Voltaire or Diderot. Catherine's approach to this enormous task was characteristically methodical. She began by surrounding herself with capable administrators and advisors, many of them chosen not for their noble birth or court connections, but for their intelligence and competence. She established regular routines for reviewing policy, meeting with officials, and staying informed about conditions throughout her empire. Unlike many rulers who preferred the comfortable isolation of court life, Catherine made it clear that she wanted to understand the real conditions her subjects faced. Her correspondence with European intellectuals during this period reveals a ruler genuinely grappling with complex questions of governance. She wrote lengthy letters to Voltaire, sharing her thoughts on religious tolerance and legal reform. She engaged with Diderot about education and social progress. She exchanged ideas with other enlightened monarchs like Frederick the Great and Joseph II of Austria. comparing approaches to modernizing traditional societies without triggering destructive rebellion. But Catherine also discovered the vast gap between philosophical ideals and political realities. Russia in 1762 was still largely a feudal society, where nobles owned vast estates worked by millions of serfs who were legally bound to the land and could be bought, sold, or traded like property. The Orthodox Church wielded enormous influence over daily life, often resisting changes that might threaten traditional beliefs or practices. The military, though loyal to Catherine personally, was accustomed to traditional forms of authority and suspicious of foreign ideas. Perhaps Catherine's most ambitious early project was her attempt to create a new legal code for Russia, guided by Enlightenment principles of justice and human rights. In 1767, she convened a legislative commission, bringing together representatives from across Russian society to help draft what she called her nakaz, or instruction. This document, largely written by Catherine herself, was revolutionary in its advocacy for legal equality, opposition to torture, and emphasis on the presumption of innocence in criminal cases. The commission's sessions, held in the elegant halls of St. Petersburg, must have been fascinating to observe. Here were nobles and merchants, military officers and civil servants, even some representatives of the peasant class, attempting to create a legal framework for one of the world's largest empires. Catherine presided over many of these sessions herself, demonstrating her commitment to the process and her willingness to engage directly with the practical challenges of reform. But as the months passed, it became clear that the gap between Catherine's enlightened ideals and Russian social realities was perhaps too wide to bridge entirely. The Legislative Commission ultimately failed to produce a new legal code, foundering on the conflicting interests of different social groups and the practical difficulties of implementing radical changes in a traditional society. Yet even this failure taught Catherine valuable lessons about the art of possible, lessons that would guide her approach to reform for the rest of her long reign.
As evening light painted the palace walls in shades of gold and amber, Catherine found herself navigating not just the public complexities of rule, but the deeply personal challenges of love, intimacy, and human connection in a world where every relationship carried political implications. Her romantic life, which would become the subject of endless gossip and speculation, was in reality a careful balance between genuine emotional needs and the practical requirements of maintaining power. Catherine's first significant love affair after becoming empress was with Grigory Orlov, one of the military officers who had helped orchestrate her coup. Orlov was everything Peter had not been: confident, masculine, intelligent, and genuinely devoted to Catherine both as a woman and as an empress. Their relationship was passionate and, by all accounts, deeply satisfying to Catherine, who had spent so many years in an emotionally barren marriage. But Catherine was never one to let emotion cloud her political judgment. She understood that her relationship with Orlov served multiple purposes. It provided her with personal happiness, yes, but it also demonstrated to the Russian court and people that she was a vibrant, powerful woman, not some remote figure isolated in imperial solitude. Her choice of lovers sent subtle messages about her values and priorities, showing that she rewarded merit and loyalty rather than mere noble birth. The relationship with Orlov lasted over a decade, during which he served not just as Catherine's companion, but as an important political advisor and ally. However, as the years passed and Orlov's behavior became increasingly erratic, perhaps due to his awareness that he could never officially marry Catherine and become her consort, the Empress began to look elsewhere for both emotional support and political partnership. Her most significant romantic relationship was with Grigory Potemkin, a brilliant, tempestuous man who entered Catherine's life in the 1770s and remained central to it until his death. Potemkin was in many ways Catherine's intellectual equal, witty, well-read, strategically minded, and possessed of a grand vision for Russia's future that matched her own.
Their correspondence, much of which survives, reveals a relationship of remarkable depth and complexity, mixing passionate love letters with detailed discussions of military strategy and domestic policy. Whether Catherine and Potemkin ever secretly married remains one of history's great mysteries, but what's certain is that their partnership transformed both their personal lives and Russia's trajectory as a great power. Potemkin became Catherine's most trusted advisor on military and foreign affairs, helping to plan and execute the campaigns that would expand Russian territory to the Black Sea and establish the empire as a major European power. Throughout all these relationships, Catherine maintained a clear understanding of the difference between her public role and her private desires. She never allowed romantic attachments to compromise her political judgment, and she never permitted lovers to assume that their personal influence with her translated into official power. When relationships had run their course, she ended them gracefully but decisively, often providing generous settlements, but making it clear that their political usefulness had ended along with their romantic connection. Critics, both contemporary and modern, have often focused on the number of Catherine's romantic relationships, sometimes losing sight of the remarkable skill with which she managed to maintain both personal authenticity and political effectiveness. In an age when female rulers were expected to be either virgins or faithful wives, Catherine carved out a third path, that of a woman who acknowledged her human needs while never subordinating her imperial responsibilities to those needs.
In the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace lay shrouded in silence and Catherine often found herself awake, reviewing reports and correspondence, she must have sensed the tremors of discontent that were beginning to shake the foundations of her empire. It was the early 1770s, more than a decade into her reign, and the enlightened ideals she had championed were about to collide violently with the harsh realities of Russian social inequality. The rebellion that erupted in 1773 was unlike anything Catherine had expected to face as empress. It began in the distant Ural region, where a Don Cossack named Emelian Pugachev proclaimed himself to be Peter III, Catherine's supposedly dead husband, miraculously returned to claim his rightful throne. This was more than mere imposture. It was a brilliant stroke of psychological warfare that tapped into deep currents of resentment and hope among Russia's most oppressed populations. Pugachev's message was simple but revolutionary. Catherine was a usurper, a foreign-born pretender who had murdered the true Tsar and stolen his throne. He, the real Peter III, promised to overthrow this illegitimate ruler and create a new Russia, where serfs would be free, where Cossacks would govern themselves, where the burden of taxation and military service would be lifted from the common people. For millions of Russians living in poverty and bondage, this message was intoxicating. What followed was the largest peasant uprising in Russian history, a massive explosion of violence and hope that swept across the Volga region like wildfire. Pugachev's army grew from a handful of disaffected Cossacks to a force of tens of thousands, including runaway serfs, religious dissenters, ethnic minorities, and anyone who felt oppressed by the existing order. They captured fortresses, killed nobles and officials, and for a time seemed capable of marching all the way to Moscow. Catherine's response revealed both her strengths and the contradictions inherent in her position. Publicly, she maintained an appearance of calm confidence, dismissing Pugachev as a mere brigand and expressing certainty that loyal forces would quickly suppress the rebellion. Privately, however, she was deeply shaken by the uprising's scale and the enthusiasm with which oppressed populations had rallied to Pugachev's cause. The military campaign to crush the rebellion was brutal and systematic. Catherine's generals, led by experienced officers like Alexander Suvorov, employed tactics that were as much about terrorizing the population as defeating Pugachev's forces. Villages suspected of supporting the rebels were burned. Captured insurgents were hanged, tortured, or sold into even harsher forms of bondage.
When Pugachev was finally captured in 1774, he was brought to Moscow in an iron cage and publicly executed in a manner designed to demonstrate the fate that awaited those who challenged imperial authority. The rebellion's suppression marked a crucial turning point in Catherine's reign and in her personal evolution as a ruler. The woman who had once dreamed of enlightened reforms and gradual improvements in her subjects' conditions now faced the stark reality that her empire rested on foundations of inequality and oppression that could not be safely disturbed. The idealistic empress, who had corresponded with Voltaire about human rights, now authorized measures that would have horrified her philosophical mentors. In the aftermath of Pugachev's defeat, Catherine's policies shifted noticeably towards conservatism and control. Rather than addressing the underlying social tensions that had fueled the rebellion, she chose to strengthen the existing system that had made her powerful. Serfdom was not only maintained, but extended to new territories. Noble privileges were expanded and codified. The gap between Catherine's enlightened rhetoric and her practical governance became a chasm that she would never again attempt to bridge.
As the sun set over the vast Russian landscape, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Catherine often stood at the windows of her palace and gazed outward toward the horizons that marked the edges of her empire. But those edges were not fixed. Under her rule, they would expand dramatically, as Catherine pursued a vision of Russian greatness that extended far beyond the borders she had inherited. Catherine's approach to territorial expansion was methodical and strategic, driven not by mere conquest, but by a coherent vision of Russia's role in European affairs. She understood that in the 18th century, great power status required not just internal strength, but external influence. And that influence was most convincingly demonstrated through the acquisition and successful governance of new territories. Her primary focus was southward, toward the Black Sea and the weakening Ottoman Empire. For centuries, Russia had been landlocked in the south, forced to rely on distant northern ports for access to international trade routes. Catherine dreamed of changing this, of giving Russia the warm water ports that would make it a true maritime power. This was not merely a matter of economic advantage, it was about transforming Russia from a regional power into a global empire. The wars against the Ottoman Empire that dominated much of Catherine's middle reign were conducted with a professionalism and strategic coherence that reflected her careful study of military affairs. She worked closely with talented generals like Alexander Suvorov and capable administrators like Grigory Potemkin to plan campaigns that combined military effectiveness with careful attention to political and diplomatic consequences. The annexation of Crimea in 1783 was perhaps Catherine's greatest territorial achievement, a stroke of strategic brilliance that gave Russia control of the entire northern shore of the Black Sea. But it was accomplished not through a single dramatic military campaign, but through years of patient diplomatic and military pressure, combined with careful attention to the interests of local populations and neighboring powers. Catherine's expansion westward was equally calculated, taking advantage of Poland's internal weakness and the complex balance of power among European nations. Through the three partitions of Poland between 1772 and 1795, she acquired vast new territories, while avoiding the kind of major European war that might have threatened her other achievements. It was diplomacy at its most ruthless and effective, demonstrating Catherine's understanding that successful expansion required not just military capability, but also the skill to manage complex international relationships. Yet Catherine was never merely a conqueror. She understood that acquiring territory was only the beginning of the challenge. The real test lay in successfully integrating new regions and populations into the imperial system. Her approach to governing newly acquired territories was sophisticated and flexible, combining respect for local traditions and customs with the gradual introduction of Russian administrative systems. In many of the territories she acquired, Catherine established new cities, founded schools and hospitals, and created economic incentives for development and population growth. She understood that successful expansion required not just conquest, but settlement, not just military control, but genuine integration of new territories into the imperial system. By the end of her reign, Catherine had increased the territory of the Russian Empire by more than 200,000 square miles, adding millions of new subjects and transforming Russia from a primarily European power into a truly Eurasian empire. These achievements would define Russian geopolitical strategy for centuries to come, establishing patterns of expansion and influence that would shape the modern world.
As the 18th century drew toward its close and the first whispers of revolutionary change began to echo from France across Europe, Catherine found herself in the twilight of her remarkable reign, still sharp in mind and formidable in will, but increasingly aware of the complex legacy she would leave to history. The woman who had once arrived in Russia as a teenage bride had become one of the most powerful and influential rulers of her age. Yet the final chapters of her story would be marked by both triumph and the inevitable shadows that accompany great power. The French Revolution of 1789 struck Catherine with particular force, not because she feared for her own security. Her grip on Russian power remained firm, but because it represented a fundamental challenge to everything she had tried to accomplish as an enlightened monarch. The philosophers whose writings had inspired her youth were now being quoted by revolutionaries who proclaimed the equality of all men and the illegitimate nature of monarchical authority itself. Catherine's response to the revolution revealed the essential conservatism that had always underlain her enlightened rhetoric. She banned French revolutionary literature from Russia, severed diplomatic relations with the revolutionary government, and began to speak of the need for European monarchs to cooperate in suppressing this dangerous new ideology. The Empress, who had once corresponded warmly with Voltaire, now viewed the practical application of Enlightenment ideals as a mortal threat to civilized society. These final years also brought personal losses that touched Catherine deeply. The death of Grigory Potemkin in 1791 removed not just a lover and partner, but her most trusted advisor and co-architect of Russian expansion. Potemkin's passing left Catherine more isolated, surrounded by younger favorites who possessed charm and devotion, but lacked the strategic vision and political acumen that had made Potemkin irreplaceable. Her relationship with her son Paul had also become a source of constant anxiety. Catherine had never trusted Paul's judgment or temperament, viewing him as emotionally unstable and potentially dangerous as a ruler. She spent considerable time in these later years contemplating whether to bypass him entirely in favor of her grandson Alexander, whom she saw as possessing the intelligence and stability necessary for effective leadership. Yet, despite these shadows, Catherine's final years were also marked by significant achievements. She continued to expand and refine the administrative systems that governed her vast empire. She founded new educational institutions, supported the arts and sciences, and maintained Russia's position as one of Europe's great powers. Even as revolutionary fervor spread across Western Europe, Russia under Catherine remained stable, prosperous, and secure. The Empress, who had once dreamed of fundamental reforms, now focused her energies on perfecting the system she had created, ensuring that the institutions and territories she left behind would survive the transition to new leadership. She worked tirelessly on legal codes, administrative procedures, and diplomatic arrangements that would provide stability for her successors. Her understanding of her own mortality brought a certain poignancy to these final years. She knew she was nearing the end of an extraordinary journey that had taken her from obscurity to immortality, from a minor German court to the center of world affairs.
The question that occupied her thoughts was not whether she would be remembered, that was certain, but how history would judge the choices she had made and the empire she had built.
On a cold November evening in 1796, as winter settled over St. Petersburg and the palace corridors grew quiet with the approaching night, Catherine suffered a massive stroke while working at her desk, surrounded by the papers and correspondence that had defined her daily routine for over 3 decades. She died 2 days later, at the age of 67, having reigned as Empress of Russia for 34 remarkable years. The transition that followed her death was swift but troubled. Paul I immediately ascended the throne, and in one of his first acts, ordered that his mother be buried beside Peter III, the husband she had overthrown and who had died under mysterious circumstances during her rise to power. It was a gesture laden with symbolism and perhaps revenge, uniting in death 2 people who had been bitter enemies in life. But Paul's attempt to diminish his mother's legacy was doomed to failure. Catherine's achievements were too substantial, her impact on Russia and European history too profound to be erased by the vindictiveness of her successor. Within 5 years, Paul himself would be dead, assassinated by nobles who found his erratic rule intolerable, and the throne would pass to Catherine's beloved grandson Alexander, who would guide Russia through the Napoleonic Wars and into the 19th century. Catherine's true monument was not any building or statue, but the Russian Empire itself as she had transformed it. She had taken a nation that was largely isolated from European affairs and made it a central player in international politics. She had expanded Russian territory to an extent that would not be equaled by any of her successors. She had established administrative and educational systems that would serve as the foundation for Russian governance well into the modern era. Perhaps most importantly, she had demonstrated that effective leadership could transcend the circumstances of birth. The minor German princess who had arrived in Russia with no legitimate claim to power had ruled longer and more successfully than most monarchs who inherited their thrones by unquestioned right. She had proven that intelligence, determination, and political skill could be more valuable than noble bloodlines or military conquest. Her legacy in the realm of ideas was equally significant. Although she had ultimately chosen political stability over social reform, her early championing of Enlightenment ideals had introduced concepts of legal equality, religious tolerance, and rational governance into Russian political discourse. Future reformers would draw inspiration from her writings and correspondence, even when they criticized the practical limitations of her achievements. The woman who had once written that power without a nation's confidence is nothing, had succeeded in creating a bond between ruler and empire that outlasted her physical presence. When Russians looked back on the reign of Catherine II, they remembered not just territorial expansion or military victories, but a sense of imperial grandeur and cultural achievement that made them proud of their national identity. In the gentle quiet of history's judgment, Catherine the Great stands as one of the most remarkable figures of the 18th century, a ruler who combined personal charisma with political genius, who balanced idealistic aspirations with pragmatic governance, and who transformed herself from a foreign princess into the embodiment of Russian imperial majesty. Her story remains, centuries later, a testament to the transformative power of human ambition, guided by intelligence and sustained by unwavering will.
As we turn the page from the snow-covered palaces of St. Petersburg to the misty mountains and endless jungles of South America, dear friends, let us drift into a different kind of story. One born not of political ambition, but of dreams as golden as the morning sun.
Here, in the early 16th century, when Spanish conquistadors first set foot on the shores of the New World, a legend was already taking shape that would captivate imaginations and claim countless lives for centuries to come. The story begins not with Spanish gold lust, but with an indigenous ceremony of profound spiritual beauty. High in the mountains of present-day Colombia, beside the sacred waters of Lake Guatavita, the Muisca people performed a ritual that honored their connection to the divine. Their new chieftain, his body covered in gold dust from head to toe, would paddle out onto the still waters at dawn on a raft laden with precious offerings. Picture this scene in your mind's eye as you settle deeper into comfortable rest. The morning mist rising from the lake surface, the silence broken only by gentle ripples as the golden figure moves across the water. At the lake's center, the chieftain would cast emeralds and gold into the depths as offerings to the gods below, then dive into the sacred waters himself, washing away the gold dust in an act for spiritual cleansing and renewal. This ritual, which the Muisca called El Hombre Dorado, the Golden Man, was never meant to create the legend that would follow. It was simply their way of honoring the divine forces they believed governed their world. But when Spanish explorers first heard whispered accounts of this ceremony, their minds transformed spiritual symbolism into material possibility. The Golden Man became, in their imaginations, the Golden City, and El Dorado was born. How easily dreams transform in the telling, shifting like morning mist from one shape to another. What began as a sacred ritual became, in European minds, the promise of entire cities built of gold, of kingdoms where precious metals were as common as stones, of empires waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to seek them. The Spanish conquistadors, already intoxicated by their discoveries of Aztec and Incan wealth, were primed to believe in even greater treasures hidden in the unmapped vastness of South America. And so the chase began, not for a person or even a place that actually existed, but for an idea that had taken root in the European imagination with all the persistence of hope itself. El Dorado became more than a destination. It became a symbol of everything the New World seemed to promise: unlimited wealth, undiscovered wonders, and the chance for ordinary men to transform themselves into legends. As you rest there in the peaceful darkness, consider how this story reflects something eternal in human nature. Our tendency to transform the unknown into the ideal, to project our deepest desires onto the blank spaces of the map. El Dorado was never just about gold. It was about the belief that somewhere, just beyond the horizon, lay the answer to all our longings. Let your mind wander now, dear friends, into the thick, humid air of the Amazon rainforest, where Spanish explorers in their heavy armor and boots struggled through terrain unlike anything they had ever encountered. The year was 1541, and Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the more famous Francisco, was leading an expedition eastward from Quito, driven by tales of cinnamon forests and, always, the persistent dream of El Dorado. Imagine the sounds that surrounded these men as they pushed deeper into the jungle. The constant drip of moisture from leaves high above, the calls of exotic birds hidden in the emerald canopy, the splash of rivers that seemed to appear from nowhere and wind away into green mystery. This was a world that felt primordial, untouched by European civilization, alive with dangers and possibilities they could barely comprehend.
Pizarro had brought with him over 300 Spanish soldiers, hundreds of indigenous porters, horses and dogs, along with supplies meant to last for months. But the jungle was not like the familiar landscapes of Spain or even the conquered territories of the Inca. Here, everything was different. The very air seemed to breathe with life, thick with humidity that made their metal armor feel like ovens, heavy with the scent of decomposing leaves and flowering vines. As the weeks stretched into months, the expedition began to disintegrate like morning mist touched by sunlight. Food supplies dwindled and spoiled in the constant moisture. Men fell ill with fevers and diseases they had no names for. The indigenous porters, knowing the land far better than their Spanish captains, began to slip away in the night, melting back into the forest like shadows. The Spanish, weighted down by their European equipment and expectations, found themselves increasingly helpless in this green world that seemed to follow entirely different rules. Rivers changed course without warning. Paths disappeared overnight. What looked like solid ground could suddenly give way to hidden marshes that swallowed horses and men alike. In desperation, Pizarro made a fateful decision. He ordered a smaller party, led by Francisco de Orellana, to push ahead in search of food and a passage forward. Orellana's group built a makeshift boat and followed a river downstream, hoping to find supplies and then return to the main expedition. But the current was stronger than they had anticipated, carrying them ever further into unknown territory. Days turned to weeks, and Orellana realized that returning upstream was impossible. There was only one path left, forward, into whatever lay ahead. With a handful of determined men in their fragile vessel, he continued down what would later be called the Amazon River, becoming the first European to navigate it its entire length from the Andes to the Atlantic. During this incredible journey, Orellana reported seeing things that would fuel the El Dorado legend for centuries to come. He described vast settlements along the riverbanks, well-organized societies with impressive buildings and complex social structures. He spoke of encountering tribes of warrior women, fighters so fierce and skilled that his men named the great river after the Amazons of Greek mythology. Whether these accounts were accurate or colored by exhaustion, hope, and the human tendency to transform the strange into the mythical, we may never know. But they added new layers to the growing legend of El Dorado, suggesting that the Golden City might be just one of many wonders hidden in the vast South American interior. Meanwhile, back in the mountains, Pizarro's main force was dying. By the time the survivors finally stumbled back to Quito, they were broken men, hollow-eyed and haunted by their experiences. They had found no cinnamon forests, no golden cities, no easy path to wealth and glory. But they had opened a door into one of the world's last great wildernesses, and through that door, others would continue to pass, drawn always by the whisper of El Dorado, somewhere in the green depths.
As our gentle journey through history continues, dear friends, let us pause beside the still waters of Lake Guatavita, high in the Colombian mountains, where morning mist rises like the breath of sleeping gods. Here, in this almost perfectly circular crater lake, the Spanish conquistadors believed they had found the beating heart of the El Dorado legend, a place where gold had been offered to the waters for countless generations. The lake itself is a marvel of natural beauty, nestled in rolling green hills that seem to embrace it like protective arms. Its waters are dark and deep, reflecting the sky like an ancient mirror that has witnessed ceremonies older than memory. To the Muisca people who lived in these highlands, this was not simply a body of water. It was a sacred space where the earthly and divine realms touched. Picture, if you will, the ceremony that gave birth to the El Dorado myth.
In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, a new chieftain would be prepared for his sacred ritual. His body would be covered entirely in fine gold dust, applied with reverence and precision until he gleamed like a living sun. Around him, priests and nobles would gather, their faces solemn with the weight of ancient tradition. A raft, beautifully crafted and decorated with intricate designs, would be prepared and loaded with offerings. Emeralds that caught the early light like captured stars, golden figurines shaped by master craftsmen, precious objects that represented the community's gratitude and hopes. The Golden Chieftain would take his place at the center of this floating altar, surrounded by the most sacred objects his people could offer. As the first rays of sunlight touched the water's surface, the raft would be paddled slowly toward the center of the lake. The silence would be profound, broken only by the gentle splash of paddles and perhaps the soft whisper of prayers carried on the morning breeze. This was not a moment of celebration or spectacle. It was communion with forces beyond human understanding. At the lake's deepest point, the chieftain would begin to cast the offerings into the water. Each emerald, each golden ornament would disappear beneath the surface with barely a ripple, carrying with it the hopes and prayers of his people. And then, in the ceremony's climactic moment, the Golden Man himself would dive into the sacred waters, washing away the gold dust in an act of spiritual cleansing and renewal. To the Spanish conquistadors who first heard accounts of this ritual, it represented something entirely different. They saw not spiritual significance, but material opportunity. In their minds, centuries of such ceremonies meant that the bottom of Lake Guatavita must be carpeted with gold and emeralds, a treasure trove waiting to be harvested by European ingenuity and determination. And so began a series of increasingly desperate attempts to drain the lake and claim its supposed riches. These efforts, spanning centuries, would involve massive engineering projects, dangerous excavations, and the exploitation of indigenous labor. Some gold was indeed recovered from the lake's edges and shallows, just enough to keep hope alive and to justify ever more ambitious schemes. But the lake guarded its secrets well. Each attempt to fully drain it was thwarted by cave-ins, flooding, or technical limitations. The deeper treasures, if they existed, remained beyond reach, protected by the dark waters that had accepted offerings for so many generations. Perhaps in its stubborn resistance to European ambitions, the lake was offering its own kind of wisdom about the true nature of treasure and the proper relationship between human desire and the sacred mysteries of the natural world.
In the gentle twilight of the 16th century, as candlelight flickered in the chambers of English courtiers and the Thames carried whispers of adventure and opportunity, the legend of El Dorado crossed the Atlantic to capture new hearts and minds. No one embodied this English fascination more completely than Sir Walter Raleigh, a man whose life seemed crafted from equal parts poetry, ambition, and the kind of romantic idealism that makes both heroes and tragic figures. Raleigh was the epitome of the Renaissance gentleman, scholar, soldier, explorer, and poet, blessed with the kind of charismatic charm that could convince queens and commoners alike to believe in impossible dreams. He had risen to prominence in the glittering court of Elizabeth I, where intelligence and wit were as valued as sword skill and political cunning. But for all his success at court, Raleigh dreamed of something greater, a discovery that would eclipse the Spanish conquistadors' achievements and establish England as a true rival to Spanish power in the New World. When he first heard the tales of El Dorado, filtering through Spanish accounts and indigenous stories, Raleigh saw not just gold, but destiny. Here was his chance to find something the Spanish had missed, to claim a prize that would forever link his name with the great explorers of history. The Golden City became his obsession, as compelling to him as any love affair, as urgent as any military campaign. In 1595, Raleigh set sail for Guyana, the vast, mysterious region around the Orinoco River in what is now Venezuela. He had studied Spanish maps, interviewed captured natives, and convinced himself that somewhere in that green labyrinth lay a civilization that would make the Aztec and Inca empires seem modest by comparison. His expedition was well-funded and carefully planned, but no amount of preparation could have readied him for the reality of South American exploration. The journey up the Orinoco was a test of endurance that pushed Raleigh and his men to their limits. The river twisted through landscapes of stunning beauty and terrifying hostility, towering waterfalls that thundered with primal force, stretches of calm water that reflected the sky like sheets of burnished metal, and always the jungle pressing close on either side, alive with sounds and movements that spoke of a world entirely beyond European understanding. Yet Raleigh pressed on, driven by a vision that grew more vivid the deeper he traveled into the wilderness. He spoke with indigenous peoples who told him of great cities further inland, of kings who ruled from thrones of gold, of a lake so sacred that its waters had swallowed enough treasure to ransom kingdoms. Every story fed his conviction that he was close to the discovery that would transform his life and his nation's fortunes. When Raleigh finally returned to England, he brought with him no gold, no captured princes, no conclusive proof of El Dorado's existence. What he carried instead was something potentially more powerful: a story. His account of the voyage, published as The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guyana, was a masterpiece of promotional writing, full of tantalizing details and just enough vagueness to let readers' imaginations fill in the gaps. The book was a sensation, capturing the public's fascination and earning royal approval. Elizabeth herself was intrigued by Raleigh's claims, and for a time it seemed that England might throw its full resources behind the search for the Golden City. But years passed, Elizabeth died, and Raleigh found himself out of favor with the new king, James I, who was more interested in peace with Spain than in South American adventures. Still, the dream refused to die. Even after years of imprisonment in the Tower of London, Raleigh continued to believe in El Dorado, and eventually he convinced James to give him one last chance to prove his claims. This final expedition, launched when Raleigh was already an old man, would end in disaster, death, and the execution that finally silenced one of El Dorado's most eloquent champions. As centuries rolled by like gentle waves upon a distant shore, the myth of El Dorado evolved and adapted, refusing to die even as expedition after expedition returned empty-handed or never returned at all. The great green heart of South America seemed to pulse with secrets that tantalized and tormented those who dared to seek them, drawing adventurers from across Europe into its emerald depths. Portuguese fortune hunters followed winding rivers that promised to lead to golden cities but delivered only exhaustion and fever. German explorers, funded by banking houses that dreamed of South American wealth, organized elaborate expeditions with the latest equipment and the most experienced guides, only to vanish into the jungle as completely as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Dutch traders, known for their practical approach to profit, found themselves caught up in the same golden dream, following rumors and half-glimpsed possibilities deep into territories where European maps simply ended in blank spaces marked with the words "Here be dragons" or "Terra incognita." Even Jesuit missionaries, ostensibly concerned with souls rather than gold, found their expeditions shaped by the persistent hope that they might stumble upon the legendary city while carrying the gospel to indigenous peoples. The Amazon rainforest, that vast green universe that spans millions of square kilometers, became both the stage for these dreams and their executioner. It was a realm that followed its own rules, where the very air seemed alive with possibility and menace, where rivers could change course overnight and paths could disappear as if they had never existed. The canopy above blocked out most of the sun, creating a twilight world where sound carried strangely and shadows played tricks on exhausted minds. Those who ventured deepest into this green labyrinth faced challenges that would have been unimaginable to the comfortable merchants and nobles who funded their expeditions. Insects swarmed in clouds so thick they could drive men to madness.
Diseases with no European names struck without warning, leaving victims burning with fever or wasting away to shadows of their former selves. Poisonous snakes and spiders blended so perfectly with their surroundings that death could strike from any branch, any fallen log, any seemingly innocent patch of ground. But perhaps the greatest danger was not physical, but psychological. The jungle had a way of changing men's minds, of making them see things that weren't there or miss things that were. Exhausted explorers reported glimpses of golden towers through the trees, only to find nothing but tangled vines when they tried to approach. Voices seemed to call from the darkness, sometimes the voices of lost companions, sometimes speaking in languages no European had ever heard.
As we drift further into our peaceful evening together, dear friends, let us consider how the ancient dream of El Dorado has evolved and persisted into our modern age, transforming but never truly disappearing from the human imagination. Like a river that changes course but never stops flowing, the search for the Golden City has adapted to new technologies, new understanding, and new dreams. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as scientific methods replaced pure speculation and satellite imagery began to reveal the Amazon's secrets from above, a remarkable thing happened. Archaeologists and researchers began to discover that the conquistadors' accounts might not have been entirely fantasy after all. Deep within the rainforest, buried beneath centuries of vegetation and legend, lay evidence of sophisticated civilizations that had once flourished in regions the Spanish had dismissed as empty wilderness. Modern explorers, armed with radar and infrared imaging, have identified vast networks of roads, agricultural terraces, and settlement patterns hidden beneath the forest canopy. These discoveries suggest that the Amazon once supported populations far larger than anyone had imagined. Complex societies with advanced knowledge of agriculture, engineering, and social organization. Perhaps most intriguingly, researchers have found examples of terra preta, or dark earth, artificially enriched soil created by ancient Amazonians that remains fertile centuries after its creation. This suggests civilizations sophisticated enough to engineer their environment for long-term sustainability, turning poor jungle soil into agricultural gold through careful management of organic matter and nutrients. Could it be that when early Spanish explorers reported seeing great cities and organized societies along the Amazon's banks, they were witnessing the last remnants of civilizations already devastated by European diseases? Some scholars now believe that the population collapse caused by smallpox, measles, and other old-world illnesses may have preceded most Spanish exploration, leaving behind empty cities and broken societies that the conquistadors interpreted as primitive or non-existent. This new understanding has given the El Dorado legend a different kind of poignancy. Rather than a fantasy born of European greed and indigenous misdirection, it may represent the ghostly memory of real achievements, civilizations that created their own forms of wealth and splendor, different from European gold and silver, but no less impressive in their sophistication and scale. Even today, the search continues, though in forms the original conquistadors would hardly recognize. Modern treasure hunters use satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar instead of indigenous guides and crude maps. They seek not just gold and emeralds, but knowledge, understanding of how complex societies developed in one of the world's most challenging environments. The El Dorado legend has also found new life in popular culture, appearing in films, novels, and video games that capture something eternal about the human desire to discover hidden wonders. Each retelling adds new layers to the myth while preserving its essential appeal, the belief that somewhere, just beyond our current understanding, lies something extraordinary waiting to be found. In this sense, El Dorado has transcended its origins to become a metaphor for all human striving, the entrepreneur's next breakthrough, the artist's perfect creation, the scientist's revolutionary discovery. We all carry our own versions of the Golden City, those dreams that pull us forward into unknown territory, promising fulfillment if only we can journey far enough, risk enough, believe enough. And perhaps that is the real treasure that the El Dorado legend offers us. Not gold or gems, but the reminder that the human spirit refuses to accept that all mysteries have been solved, all territories mapped, all wonders discovered.
Now, dear friends, as your breathing deepens and your body settles into perfect comfort, let us journey back through time to ancient Greece, to a sacred grove where olive trees whispered in warm Mediterranean breezes and marble temples gleamed white against azure skies. Here, in a place called Olympia, something extraordinary was about to begin. Not a war or conquest, but a celebration of human potential that would echo through millennia. The year was 776 BCE, and across the scattered city-states of Greece, heralds were carrying a message that transcended political rivalries and ancient feuds. The sacred games were beginning, they announced, and for a brief, shining moment, all of Greece would unite in honor of Zeus, king of the gods, and in celebration of the divine spark that burned within mortal flesh. Olympia itself was not a city, but a sanctuary, a place set apart from the ordinary world where the sacred and the earthly met. Ancient olive groves provided shade for weary travelers, their silver-green leaves rustling with what sounded almost like whispered prayers. Springs of clear water bubbled up from the earth, offering refreshment to pilgrims who had journeyed for weeks to reach this holy ground. At the heart of the sanctuary stood the great altar of Zeus, not a building, but a mound of ashes that had grown over centuries from the burnt offerings of countless worshippers. This ash heap, sacred and ancient, would eventually reach a height of several meters, built from the remains of sacrifices offered by generations of believers seeking divine favor. The first Olympic Games were modest affairs compared to the spectacles they would later become. A single event, a sprint of roughly 192 meters, the length of the stadium itself. No starting blocks, no uniforms, no complex rules, just men running as fast as they could, their naked bodies gleaming with olive oil, racing toward a finish line that represented something far greater than simple victory. The winner of that first recorded Olympic sprint was a cook named Coroebus of Elis, a man whose name would be remembered long after kings and warriors were forgotten. His prize was not gold or silver, but something more precious in Greek eyes, a crown of wild olive leaves cut from a tree sacred to Zeus. This simple wreath, which would decay and crumble within days, carried more honor than all the treasures of Troy. But the games were never really about individual achievement, remarkable though that was. They were about something deeper, the Greek belief that physical excellence was a form of worship, that the trained human body was a living temple worthy of the gods' attention. When athletes competed at Olympia, they were not merely trying to win prizes. They were offering their strength, speed, and skill as gifts to Zeus. Before any competition began, elaborate rituals had to be performed. Bulls were sacrificed on the great altar, their smoke rising toward Mount Olympus like prayers made visible. Athletes swore solemn oaths to compete fairly and honestly, placing their hands on pieces of wild boar flesh while promising to bring no dishonor to the games. These weren't mere formalities, but sacred vows that carried the weight of divine judgment. The athletes themselves came from across the Greek world, from Athens with its philosophers and artists, from Sparta with its warrior culture, from distant colonies where Greek civilization had taken root in foreign soil. For the duration of the games, these men were not Athenians or Spartans, but simply Greeks, united by their shared language, shared gods, and shared belief in the transformative power of physical excellence. As you rest there in the peaceful darkness, imagine the scene. The morning sun casting long shadows across the running track, the scent of olive oil and incense hanging in the warm air, the expectant silence just before the race begins.
In the gentle rhythm of your breathing, dear friends, lies an echo of something sacred that the ancient Greeks understood deeply: the power of pause, of setting aside conflict in favor of something higher and more noble. For you see, the Olympic Games could not have existed without one of history's most remarkable achievements, the sacred truce, or ekaichia, that transformed the usually war-torn landscape of ancient Greece into a peaceful pilgrimage route every 4 years. Picture Greece in the 8th century BCE, not the unified nation we might imagine today, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own government, its own customs, its own jealously guarded territories. Athens and Sparta, Corinth and Argos, dozens of communities that viewed each other with suspicion when they weren't actively at war. Border disputes were common, trade rivalries constant, and the clash of bronze weapons on bronze shields was as familiar a sound as the bleating of sheep or the creaking of cartwheels. Yet every 4 years, something miraculous occurred. Heralds from Elis, the city-state that governed Olympia, would travel throughout the Greek world carrying olive branches and proclamations of the sacred truce. This wasn't a suggestion or a polite request. It was a binding religious obligation that carried the authority of Zeus himself. For 1 month, sometimes extending to 3, all warfare was to cease. Armies were to lay down their weapons. Borders were to open. The business of killing and conquest was to pause, so that Greeks could remember their common heritage. The practical implications of this truce were extraordinary. Imagine enemy soldiers, men who might have been trying to kill each other just weeks before, now traveling the same roads in peace, all heading toward Olympia with the same purpose. Picture the scene at border crossings, where guards who usually challenged every stranger now waved through groups of athletes, trainers, spectators, and vendors, all protected by the sacred promise of safe passage. This wasn't merely a convenient arrangement to ensure good attendance at the Games. It represented a profound statement about Greek values, the belief that some things transcended even the most bitter political rivalries. The worship of Zeus, the celebration of human excellence, and the gathering of the Greek community were deemed more important than any territorial dispute or dynastic quarrel. The truce created a special kind of time, separate from the ordinary flow of political events. During these sacred periods, Greece became what it could be, rather than what it usually was: a unified community celebrating shared ideals, rather than a collection of suspicious neighbors preparing for the next war. Merchants could travel safely with their goods. Families could visit relatives in distant cities, and young men could compete without worrying that their home cities might be under siege while they were away. Violations of the sacred truce were rare and severely punished. To break the peace of Zeus was to invite divine wrath, and few were willing to risk the anger of the king of the gods for temporary military advantage. When violations did occur, the offending city-state faced heavy fines, exclusion from future games, and the lasting shame of having dishonored the most sacred tradition in the Greek world. As you drift
deeper into restful sleep, let your mind embrace this ancient wisdom. The understanding that even in a world filled with conflict and competition, there can be moments of universal peace. Times when all humanity recognizes something greater than their immediate concerns and chooses harmony over hostility.
In the soft darkness that embraces you now, dear friends, imagine the morning sun rising over the sacred grove of Olympia, its golden light revealing a sight that would have seemed both shocking and beautiful to modern eyes. Hundreds of athletes preparing for competition, their bodies unclothed, gleaming with olive oil, moving with the fluid grace of living sculptures carved by years of training and discipline. To understand the ancient Olympic Games, we must set aside our modern sensibilities about modesty and privacy. For the Greeks saw the human body not as something to be hidden, but as a masterpiece to be celebrated. The word gymnasium comes from the Greek gymnos, meaning naked. And this wasn't mere etymology, but philosophy made flesh. The Greeks believed that the unclothed body was the truest expression of human potential, that physical beauty and athletic prowess were reflections of moral virtue and divine favor. Picture these ancient athletes as they prepared for competition, men who had trained for years in gymnasiums throughout the Greek world, their bodies shaped by endless hours of running, wrestling, throwing the discus and javelin. They rubbed olive oil into their skin, not for vanity, but for practical reasons: to reduce chafing during competition, to make their muscles more supple in the Mediterranean heat, and to create a surface on which fine sand could be sprinkled to provide better grip for wrestling and other contact sports. Each athlete was a work of art in motion, representing not just his own dedication, but the ideals of his entire community. The Spartans, known for their military discipline, produced athletes who moved with the precision of soldiers. The Athenians, with their love of philosophy and beauty, often fielded competitors whose physical grace seemed to embody their city's artistic sensibilities. Men from the Greek colonies brought their own regional styles and techniques, creating a rich tapestry of human excellence. The competitions themselves were rituals of transformation. When a young man stepped onto the track at Olympia, he wasn't merely entering a race. He was offering himself and his abilities to the gods, submitting to divine judgment, seeking to prove himself worthy of immortal fame. Every stride, every throw, every wrestling hold was both athletic technique and religious expression. Victory at Olympia brought rewards that transcended mere material gain. The olive wreath placed on a champion's head was cut from trees that grew in Zeus's sacred grove, living symbols of divine approval that would wither and crumble within days, reminding winners that even the greatest triumphs were temporary. But the fame that came with victory was eternal. Olympic champions returned home to processions, banquets, and honors that could last a lifetime. Some victors received free meals for life in their city's town hall. Others had statues erected in their honor, immortalizing their moment of triumph in marble and bronze. Poets composed elaborate victory odes, complex, beautiful works that wove the champion's achievement into the fabric of myth and legend, ensuring that their names would be remembered as long as Greek culture endured. But perhaps most importantly, these athletes embodied the Greek concept of arete, excellence of character expressed through physical achievement. They proved that mortal beings could, through dedication and divine favor, approach the perfection of the gods themselves.
In their naked striving, their willingness to compete before the eyes of all Greece, they demonstrated the courage, discipline, and nobility that the Greeks valued above all other virtues. As your own body finds perfect rest in the comfort of your bed, let yourself appreciate the simple miracle of human movement, the gift of physical existence, the way flesh and spirit work together to create moments of grace and beauty that echo across millennia.
Now, dear friends, as our peaceful journey through history continues, let us turn our attention from the sacred games of Greece to another wonder of the ancient world, a magnificent statue that once stood sentinel over the harbor of Rhodes, watching over sailors and merchants with bronze eyes that seemed to hold the light of the sun itself. The Colossus of Rhodes was born from victory rather than worship, created not to honor distant gods, but to celebrate human resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. In 305 BCE, the island city of Rhodes found itself besieged by one of the most formidable military forces of the ancient world, the army of Demetrius Poliorcetes, whose very name meant the besieger, and who had earned that title through his ability to crush any city that dared resist his power. For nearly a year, the people of Rhodes endured siege engines that towered like artificial mountains, catapults that hurled boulders the size of houses, and blockades that threatened to starve them into submission. But the Rhodians, skilled sailors and clever engineers, refused to surrender. They burned siege towers, sabotaged war machines, and fought with the desperate courage of people who knew that defeat meant slavery or death. When Demetrius finally abandoned his siege, leaving behind the twisted wreckage of his mighty war engines, the Rhodians faced a choice. They could simply repair their walls and return to normal life, grateful to have survived. Instead, they chose to create something that would ensure their victory was never forgotten. A statue so immense, so magnificent, that it would proclaim to all the world that Rhodes had not merely survived, but triumphed. The bronze for their great statue came from the very weapons that had threatened them. Abandoned catapults were melted down and recast as the skin of a god. Siege towers became the materials for a monument to peace. The instruments of war were transformed into a celebration of the divine protection that had saved their city. The Colossus took 12 years to complete, rising slowly from the harbor like a bronze mountain shaped by human will and divine inspiration. Chairs of Lindos, the master sculptor who oversaw its creation, had trained under Lysippos, the artist who had immortalized Alexander the Great in bronze and marble. He understood that this statue had to be more than merely large. It had to embody the spirit of a people who had refused to be conquered. When finished, the Colossus stood over 100 feet tall, its bronze surface gleaming like captured sunlight, its face serene but watchful, its presence transforming the very character of Rhodes Harbor. Sailors approaching from the sea would see it from miles away, this giant guardian who seemed to welcome friends and warn enemies with equal majesty. For 54 years, the Colossus stood as one of the most famous landmarks in the ancient world. Travelers journeyed hundreds of miles just to see it, to stand in its shadow and marvel at what human hands could create when inspired by gratitude and determination. But in 226 BCE, the earth beneath Rhodes trembled with devastating force. An earthquake that lasted only minutes undid 12 years of careful construction. The great statue, built to seem eternal, snapped at the knees and crashed to the ground in a cascade of bronze and broken dreams. In the quiet darkness of this peaceful evening, dear friends, there is something deeply comforting about contemplating the graceful acceptance of impermanence. how even the mightiest achievements must eventually yield to time and change, and how this yielding can be its own kind of beauty. The fallen Colossus of Rhodes became, in many ways, more moving than the standing statue had ever been. Visitors who came to see its ruins found themselves confronted not just with the remnants of human ambition, but with a profound meditation on the nature of greatness itself. Here lay bronze limbs so massive that a man could barely wrap his arms around a single finger, testimony to the incredible skill and determination of its creators. The Rhodians faced a choice that many communities have confronted throughout history. Should they attempt to restore what had been lost, to rebuild their shattered monument and pretend that the earthquake had never happened? Practical concerns argued against such an effort. The cost would be enormous, the engineering challenges daunting, the political situation uncertain. But there was another consideration, one that spoke to deeper wisdoms about the nature of memory and meaning. The oracle at Delphi, consulted about whether the statue should be rebuilt, delivered a cryptic response suggesting that Helios, the sun god, had been offended by the original Colossus, and that rebuilding it might invite further divine displeasure. Whether the Rhodians truly believed this warning or simply found it a convenient excuse for a decision they had already made for other reasons, they chose to leave the ruins where they lay. This choice transformed the site into something unprecedented in the ancient world, a monument to both human achievement and human humility. Travelers could walk among the fallen bronze pieces and touch history directly, running their hands along metal that had once gleamed high above the harbor. The ruins became a place of pilgrimage, not despite their broken state, but because of it. Roman writers like Strabo described these remains with awe, noting how even lying on its side, the thumb of the Colossus was so thick that most people could not wrap their arms around a single finger, testimony to the incredible skill and determination of its creators. For 8 centuries, the fallen Colossus remained one of the most famous tourist destinations in the Mediterranean world. It appeared in travel accounts, inspired poetry, and served as a symbol for the bittersweet nature of all human accomplishment. Visitors came not seeking the triumphant spectacle of an intact monument, but something more subtle and perhaps more profound. A reminder that even the greatest works are temporary, and that accepting this temporariness can free us to appreciate beauty wherever we find it. The final disappearance of the Colossus came not through natural disaster, but through very human needs. When Arab forces captured Rhodes in 654 CE, they saw in the bronze ruins not history or symbolism, but valuable raw material. According to historical accounts, the metal was sold to a Jewish merchant who transported it away on 900 camels, a detail that may be exaggerated but captures something true about how the practical needs of one age can erase the monuments of another. Yet even this ending carries its own kind of poetry. The bronze that had once embodied Rhodian pride and artistic achievement was transformed again, melted down and reshaped into objects we can only imagine. Perhaps some small portion of the great Colossus lives on in jewelry, in coins, in household items scattered across the medieval world, carrying forward in humble forms the metal that once caught the Mediterranean sunlight in the shape of a god.
As we approach the gentle conclusion of our evening's journey together, dear friends, let us reflect on what the story of the Colossus of Rhodes teaches us about the relationship between ambition and acceptance, between the desire to create something permanent and the wisdom to find peace with impermanence. The Colossus was never just a statue, it was a statement, a declaration that human beings could transform their struggles into something beautiful, their victories into lasting inspiration. The Rhodians who conceived and built this wonder were responding to more than just military triumph.
They were expressing a fundamental human need to create meaning from chaos, to shape raw materials into forms that speak to something eternal in the human spirit. When we consider the 12 years it took to complete this marvel, we can almost see the daily life of its creation, workers arriving each morning to continue their impossible task, bronze being carefully cast and fitted piece by piece, the statue rising inch by inch against the Mediterranean sky. There must have been moments of doubt, times when the project seemed too ambitious, too costly, too risky. Yet they persevered, driven by a vision that transcended immediate practical concerns. The completed Colossus served its purpose magnificently for over half a century, becoming a symbol not just of Rhodes, but of human capability itself. It showed that mortals could create works that rivaled the grandest productions of nature, that skill and determination could literally move mountains, or at least build monuments that seemed to touch the heavens. But the earthquake that felled the great statue delivered a lesson as important as any taught by its construction. In a single devastating moment, it demonstrated that no human creation, however magnificent, however carefully planned, is immune to forces beyond our control. The bronze giant that had seemed so permanent, so invulnerable, revealed itself to be as fragile as any other work of human hands. Yet this revelation of vulnerability didn't diminish the Colossus, it completed it. The fallen statue taught visitors something that the standing monument never could, that true greatness lies not in permanence, but in the courage to create beauty despite impermanence, to strive for excellence while accepting that all achievements are temporary. The ruins of the Colossus became a different kind of monument, one that honored both human ambition and human humility, that celebrated the drive to build while acknowledging the forces that inevitably tear down. In its broken state, it spoke to something universal about the human condition, about our eternal struggle between the desire to leave lasting marks and the need to accept that nothing lasts forever. Today, Rhodes Harbor shows no trace of the great statue that once dominated its skyline. The bronze is long gone, melted down and transformed into countless other objects. The stone foundations have crumbled or been built over, yet the Colossus lives on in a form its creators never anticipated. As an idea, as inspiration, as a reminder that the most meaningful monuments exist not in physical space, but in human memory and imagination. When the Statue of Liberty was designed, its creators consciously evoked the Colossus of Rhodes, understanding that some symbols transcend their original time and place to speak to universal human aspirations. In this way, the ancient bronze giant found a kind of resurrection, its spirit embodied in new forms that carry forward its essential message, that human beings, working together with vision and determination, can create wonders that inspire across centuries.
And so, dear friends, our gentle journey together through the corridors of time draws to its peaceful close, like the last notes of a lullaby fading into the comforting silence of night. We have traveled far tonight, visiting the palaces of ambitious empresses, the misty jungles where dreamers sought golden cities, the sacred groves where ancient athletes honored the gods, and the harbor where a bronze giant once stood guard over the seas. Each story we've shared carries within it something eternal, the human capacity to dream beyond our circumstances, to transform struggle into beauty, to create meaning from chaos. Catherine the Great showed us that intelligence and determination can reshape destiny itself. The Seekers of El Dorado reminded us that sometimes the journey matters more than the destination.
The Olympic athletes of ancient Greece demonstrated that excellence can be a form of worship. And the Colossus of Rhodes taught us that true magnificence lies not in permanence, but in the courage to create beauty despite impermanence. These tales from long ago connect us to the endless stream of human experience, reminding us that we are part of a story that began long before our birth and will continue long after we are gone. In the quiet darkness of this evening, you are linked to every dreamer who has ever looked up at the stars and wondered about their place in the vast tapestry of existence. Thank you for spending these peaceful hours with me, for allowing these stories to carry you gently toward rest. If this content helped you find the relaxation you were seeking, please remember to subscribe to join our growing community of evening wanderers. A gentle like and share would mean the world to me, helping others discover these soothing journeys through history. If you have suggestions for future stories we might explore together, perhaps the quiet wisdom of ancient philosophers, or the gentle mysteries of medieval monasteries where scribes preserved knowledge by candlelight, please leave them in the comments below. The stories are endless, dear friends, and the night is patient, and there will always be another evening when we can meet again in this peaceful space between day and dreams. Until then, let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of gentle waves on distant shores. Let your thoughts scatter like dandelion seeds on a summer breeze, each one carrying a small piece of the wonder we've shared tonight. Feel yourself surrounded by the warm presence of all who have sought rest before you. The ancient Greeks sleeping under star-filled skies, the medieval pilgrims finding shelter in monastery cells, the Renaissance explorers dreaming of tomorrow's discoveries. Know that in this moment of peaceful transition from waking to sleeping, you are exactly where you need to be. Catherine's court has grown quiet, the candles extinguished in the winter palace. The Amazon jungle settles into its nightly chorus of mysterious sounds. The Olympic flames have been banked until tomorrow's competitions. The Colossus of Rhodes rests in peaceful ruins, teaching its lessons to the wind and waves. And you, dear friend, can rest now too. You can let go of today's concerns and sink into the soft embrace of sleep. Let these stories become part of your dreams tonight, gentle companions accompanying you into the realm of rest and renewal. Sleep well, dear friends. Sleep peacefully. Know that somewhere in the vast tapestry of human experience, all these stories continue, woven together by the simple human need to find meaning, beauty, and connection in our brief time beneath the stars. Rest well, dream sweetly, and good night.